All right, so this is Module 12, and we're going to be moving on to the High Middle Ages. And if you keep in mind this kind of idea that the Middle Ages in Western Europe is kind of like a roller coaster, we're now going to be moving towards the high point. So if you had to be alive during the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages is probably the time period you wanted to live in. And one of those reasons is because life improves during this time period because some of the institutions that they have in place. And today we're going to look at feudalism and manorialism. And I should caution you that because we're going to be talking about these, which have kind of a social component, as well as an economic and political aspects that deal with, the social issues, that we're really going to have a general picture. But if you really study the era of this time period and feudalism, manorialism, and how they're applied and vary from place to place and time period to time period within the Middle Ages, it would vary greatly. So just kind of keep that in mind as that we're kind of giving you a general picture, but if you study it more, you'll find out that the general picture doesn't always match up with what happens specifically in every location. Now, in this class, what do we mean about when we say feudalism? Well, the definition that we're going to use is a political and social system between lords and vassals. And when you look at the relationship between lords and vassals, it should call to mind some of the earlier relationships that we've been studying about in class, because feudalism has a lot of similarities to the patron-client system from the time period of the Romans, and also the relationship between a king and his war band in the early Middle Ages. So just like those systems, you have two parties. Each party has a set of obligations and a set of benefits from this relationship. So in the relationship of feudalism, a lord is going to give gifts to his vassals. In exchange, the vassal is going to offer, homage, which simply means loyalty, honor, and respect, and also services. Now, the gifts that the lord is giving is usually gifts of land, though they could include gifts like food and housing and protection. But especially if you happen to be getting a gift from a king, then that gift is going to be land, and that land is going to be called a fief. The reason why it's called a fief is because fiefs are hereditary. So if you get a fief, this means that this grant of land that you get from the king can be passed to your children after you die. And your children will simply have to renew the oath that they take to the king, but they will continue to be able to have that land. When other vassals offer homage and military service as part of their obligations, their services could vary widely. Though the most important service, and the one that you should really remember, is that vassals usually provide military service to their lords. This means that anytime a king wants to go to war, he'll call upon his vassals to come, and they will be the ones who will be fighting for him. There's a whole host of other kinds of services that vassals can provide for their lords. These services could include things like giving gifts to the lord's children, either when their sons are knighted or their daughters get married. They can also, read an oath of loyalty where the vassal promises that he would uphold, this kind of feudal oath. And so when the Lord would come to visit and stuff, when the Lord was ready to leave, he would hold, the stirrup of his horse steady for the Lord to be able to mount the horse. Another service you might see is when lords come to visit their vassals, the vassals were promised to feed them and, give them a feast while they were there. So lots of different services, but all these services and all these gifts get spelled out in the feudal oath. So this is how a lord and vassal would enter into a relationship. They would swear an oath. And these feudal oaths, as we say, will really explain all the gifts that the Lord is giving and all the services that the Lord is going to do for him. So if we look at this kind of flow chart over here, you can see that if a lord and a vassal is making a feudal oath, with a king, the king might say, well, you're going to get this particular piece of land in this area, and then the vassal is going to swear to be loyal to the king and swear to come to his aid anytime he wants to raise a military. If either side does not live up to their obligations, the feudal oath is broken. So if the lord does not give all the gifts that he promised to his vassal, or the lord tries to extract services beyond those that the vassal has sworn to give, then that was a sign that the lord had broken the oath and the vassal is no longer required to, go on board with it. If the vassal goes back on his word and maybe doesn't provide the required military service or some of these other services given by a vassal, then, it's kind of interesting. You can see that, the Lord is within his rights to take the gifts away. Now, it's kind of interesting if you look at the chart, it's that you can see that it is possible to be both a lord and a vassal at the same time. You might be a vassal of a king, but have vassals of your own. So this would, make you a lord to them. We tend to see in medieval society that it's a feudal society. You have a king at the top, and then you have great nobles, and then these nobles are vassals of the king. But they're also lords of other vassals below them, and the vassals that are below them can be, lesser nobility, some of the knights, and you can see that there's lesser vassals that might not get major grants of land. Instead, they might be getting a place to live, some food, some protection. But in exchange, they're going to give loyalty and homage and military service to that lord. The final part of the social system, we say, is down here, and it involves the peasants or the serfs. Now, this is actually a part of the manorial system, but you can see it's going to be set up very similar to the feudal system in that the peasants are going to receive things like protection and food and possibly shelter. And in exchange, they're going to give services like farming, and that's what we're going to kind of look at next here. Now, we just talked about how feudalism is a political and social system. Manorialism is closely related. It's an economic and social system, whereas feudalism involves agreements between lords and vassals. Manorialism involves agreements between lords and serfs. And serfs is a particular type of peasant. A serf is a peasant who is not free because the serf owes obligations to the lord. They're part of this manorial system. So in manorialism, it's a mutual relationship where each side has obligations and benefits. The lord's obligation is to protect his serfs. If the area is attacked, the serfs can flee either to the castle or the manor house, and the lord is going to have his knights there, and he's going to protect the serfs from attack. So that's what the benefit that the serfs get. Usually, lords will provide their serf with a feast once a year, though this does vary from place to place. The serfs have obligations in exchange for this protection that they get. Their main obligation is to work the lord's land. So the lord oftentimes will receive land from the king, his fief. The lord is not going to go out there and start planting the fields. That's the job of the serfs. So the serfs are kind of legally tied to the land. If the land changes hands, the serfs go with it. They're not slaves. They can't be bought or sold, but they do get transferred along with the land. If they want to leave the manor, they want to leave the land and go get married, they actually have to get the lord's permission in most cases to do that. And if they run away, the lord has the right to track them down and force them to come back to the land and work. So this is what the lord gets out of it. He has these serfs, these peasants that are tied to the land. They're going to work for him. And that's how he's going to be able to support his household, because he's going to get a cut of the produce that's being grown on his land. The serfs also have to help maintain the manor. They have to maintain the roads, the bridges, the fences. They'll also pay fees to the lord if they want to use the lord's mills, his workshops, his storage barns. So if you look at manorialism, it's an unequal relationship that we have here. Certainly, if you have to be involved in manorialism, the preferred part to be in is to be the lord. The lord certainly gets more out of this than the peasants do. But for the peasants, it does mean that they do get protection from invaders, and the lord's going to protect them if they get attacked. So the lord will give them a small piece of land to work and support, and have food to support their families on as well. Now, the term manorialism comes from the medieval manor. So in a medieval manor, you have a manor house. Could also be like a castle, and this is where the lord would live. And then the fief that has been granted to the lord is divided up into several segments. And so that's going to be the fields where they're going to bring the food from. And in the field, they usually divide those fields up into little strips of land. One of those strips is, in each field is going to be the land that's held by the lord. So anything grown on that strip of land gets taken to the manor house when it's harvested. So this is how the lord is going to feed all his knights and the members of his household. And this strip is known as the domain. And you don't need to know whatever, the demesnes, the demesnes. And that's the strip of land that's going to grow for the lord. Then you have serfs, working the other strips of land. Anything they grow on that strip belongs to them. And kind of like the fief, the serf's holdings are also hereditary. So if a serf has been granted a particular strip of land, when the serf gets old and dies, his son could take over that strip of land and farm it and for his family. And that type of farming that they kind of developed is important. And it's a thing that kind of developed into what becomes known as the three-field crop rotation system. Prior to the Middle Ages, a lot of times they were working a two-field crop rotation where they would plant one field, leave another field empty, so they didn't exhaust the soil. But as we move into the Middle Ages, particularly the High Middle Ages, we start seeing them divide land into three fields. And this way you can have one field empty so it can kind of recover, and you're going to do early planting on it, and then a field where you can do later planting in. And so this way you have three fields, two-thirds of the land being used. over the course of the year instead of only half. And the end result is going to be increased productivity. So this is much more effective method of farming than we see taking place before. There's also usually some land on the fief that the Lord gets that is not good for farming, and that usually becomes pasture land. And that's sometimes what's known as commons or common land. And anyone from the village or community can pasture their animals in this common land. And we find that there's a bunch of buildings that are being added to the manor house. So you'll have workshops there, things like blacksmith shop, because you're going to need implements, and repairs for stuff. And you might need leather work, and this goes in these workshops. And they'll be able to have some bakeries that, might have a lord that, actually sets up someone to be a baker. So you wouldn't have to bake your own bread. You just take your grain to the baker, and he would bake the bread for you. And of course, he would take his cut of the payment. And of course, there would be various mills and barns to store grain in. And so you have an example here of a water mill. The point here is that medieval manors were pretty much self-sufficient. And this would be important in terms of the economy, because once you lived on one of these manors, you wouldn't really need to get a lot of things from the outside. So they basically still continue to function, provided they weren't being attacked from outside forces. But the other thing that we see is that they move to the 3-field crop rotational system, and this is going to provide them with a lot more produce, and this is going to lead people to living healthier lives. But also, we're going to see that this is going to cause some economic prosperity to break out as well. So, the feudalism is an arrangement between lords and vassals. Lords give their vassals usually gifts of land. Vassals in return provide services to the lord, mainly military service, though there can be some others as well. Feudalism, while it does vary in how it's implemented from place to place and from time to time, overall, the High Middle Ages, it does create political stability because it's tying vassals to their lord through these oaths of fealty. And this keeps things fairly stable in Europe. The other part is manorialism, and manorialism, again, is the system that involves lords and serfs. The lord provides protection for the serfs, and in exchange, the serfs work the land for the lord, as well as providing a variety of other kinds of services for the lord and having other kinds of obligations for him. The manorial system is very significant because it ends up including new farming technologies like the horse collar, 3-field rotation. Both of these are going to help economic prosperity because they bring a larger agricultural harvest. The horse collar lets you use horses to plow fields, so you don't rely on oxen power or human power. You can use horses, hook them up to the plows. And the 3-field rotation lets you have 2/3 of the land in operation every year. So that's going to lead to better harvest. And with this, we're going to see that the High Middle Ages, this agricultural revolution, if you will, is going to help us lead to a commercial revolution. And so life is really looking up when we get to the High Middle Ages, more and more and more. And they don't really have anybody, that, is going to disrupt this for quite some time. And that's going to make a big difference. And that brings us to an end of our first lecture.